This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It is 11:11 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast, and you're on Ask a Rabbi.
Hello there. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb for Congregation Eitz Chayim, and welcome to this beautiful Friday, the Friday of Martin Luther King weekend. And yes, I am old enough to remember Martin Luther King. Me and the dinosaurs.
Yeah. It's interesting trying to explain that to some of the players.
That you can actually know Martin Luther King. Yeah.
Oh, man.
So my father and my oldest brother both marched with him.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, now that's cool.
Yeah. So
Where? What towns?
That I'd have to look up very candidly. My oldest brother actually left college. He had to give up on a science engineering degree and go into sociology because he missed so much school.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
He felt that strongly about it. So, yeah. And at the time, I didn't know that brother because my father had two marriages.
Okay.
And he was from the first marriage. So we didn't know that was going on. I learned about that much later.
Wow, that's amazing, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
From folks who walked with Dr. King, said it was a life-changing experience.
Yeah,
I knew a couple in California that did.
I think to actually participate in something that is history forming for a country has a feel to it. And I was thinking about, I'm lucky enough to have been invited to one of the Martin Luther King services in the community, the one at Morningside on Monday. I'll be giving the benediction, so I'm quite honored, to do that. And and it's kind of had me thinking, right? So part of Dr. King's dream. I also teach it to some of my students. The English students, there's a unit that we do on Dr. Martin Luther King, and it talks about how some of his friends growing up were white and then they couldn't play together, right? Because after you get to a certain age, you're no longer equal in the Old South, and and then I got to thinking, and then there's this banter going on around about who's better and who's worse, and I'm sorry, that's just garbage. I'm going to say it. It's garbage. If you have to believe that you or somebody else is superior just automatically instead of by what you do and what you bring to the table, then you need to look at yourself a little bit, because I think people in general who feel that way don't like themselves. How's that for a strong feeling? Strong statement. If you think you have to inherently be better just because you're white, male, purple, Muslim, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, any of those groups with which you form an identity does not automatically give you superiority. It just doesn't.
The whole thing is absurd if you think that way.
And yet we've got people all over who are racist and sexist, myself included. Right? I'm not going to say that I'm immune to it. I'm not. All of us have it. We have to unlearn it. We pick it up because we want it to be true. Right? That is one of the things that I tell my students. We do this exercise of what do you really know? And I've done it with you where I've asked you the question, right? And you push long enough and you get to a place where people have to admit they don't really know. We really don't know anything. But we've come to agreements with each other in order to live. So one of those agreements in most traditions, I'm going to jump into the faith traditions now, is that God created us. Okay? Now, I'm also going to take this into an atheist's standpoint. If you don't believe that God created, then we're absolutely all equal. And you better not have some kind of idea that some of us were spawned differently. We all started from the same, whether it's Adam and Eve or a blood clot or, you got to ask then where the blood comes from, but that's another story. That's one of my favorite.
I still don't understand how an atheist gets through life. I mean, you hear a lot of, that scientists are not religious, but I don't know. You look around and see this world and you realize there's something a lot bigger than us.
Yeah, well, and I obviously agree with that. I don't think I think that for some folks, it's just not an important issue. There's not the worrying about why are we here. They're much more fascinated with how things work. Okay, and so getting to those things, right? There are doctors who are theists and doctors who are not. There are scientists who are theists and scientists who are not. There's a wonderful discussion in the old House show. Remember?
Yeah,
Dr. House, and his best friend is dying of cancer. The oncologist is dying of cancer.
I remember that show.
And at one point, he turns to House and he said, "Look, I have sat with people when they die. I believe that there's something." Right. So here's somebody who's treating people at the end of life, and he's had experiences that have convinced him that there is something more to life in general, to the soul, to whatever. Right? He has seen something that has convinced him that it's not just killing the rose in the bush. And so you got to take a look at that. I think where people get in trouble is where they think that they are capable of judging what's fair and what's not. That's where we get in trouble, because that's when we start to say, I'm not being treated fairly. Why is this happening to me? Probably the craziest version of that for me was when I was a chaplain and I got called to the ER because there was an active alcoholic who had advanced pancreatic and liver cancer. I know that you talked about that on Ask a Lawyer. A little bit about pancreatic cancer, and there's supposedly a cure treatment being in final stages of testing right now. So I hope that really works too. There's so many false starts in the cancer world.
Well, yeah, that's the disease throws you curveballs.
Yeah,
all the time.
well, all of the cancers throw you curveballs.
You bet.
There's another. I'll quote Grey's Anatomy. Tumors are alive. Tumors are alive.
You watch the medical shows, don't you?
I like to watch the medical shows. Yeah, I guess so. At least those two. I got hooked into both of them.
I loved House.
I got hooked into House when he was treating this is a really off the wall side story. But there's an episode where he's treating a woman who collapses in the chair at a wedding. She's being lifted up for it's a Jewish wedding, and she's being lifted up for the dance. And she faints off the chair, and so she ends up with House. And House finds this really weird condition where her organs shift and cause a plummet in her blood pressure, and so she passes out.
Oh, brother.
Oh, yeah. Some of their medical conditions were a little bit strange. So why did I get hooked on that one? Because a friend of mine, of all crazy things, his song was used in the wedding scene. And so he let everybody know. He said, this is my song, blah, 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 blah. So, of course, I tuned in and I got hooked. And so I watched it on, I don't know, either Prime or Netflix or
Oh, Carol and I were hooked on that show. Yeah.
And so I watched it all the way to the end there. And, I can't remember the name of the other doctor. I can see him in front of my face, but the name is escaping me in the moment. But it was the oncologist, and he was dying of cancer. And, he had an experience. And so I think that for a lot of atheists or for people who are non-religious, it's just that the God piece is not important. Okay, they're more concerned with something else. Perhaps it's why water boils, or where the farthest star is, or whatever drives somebody. In some ways that becomes their reason for being, and so they don't need the connection that religion offers.
See, I never thought about that angle.
Yeah, so it's not that they don't believe. It's that they haven't tapped into it. And now I'm going to lay something at the feet of some organized religions, and some organized religions have become so dead inside their buildings. Their services are not uplifting. They're not inviting. They're not spiritual. There's an amazing story about the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov stories are from several hundred years ago, couple hundred years ago, and he's traveling, and he goes into a synagogue building, and they say to him, well, come on in. And he says, I can't come in because the room is crowded with your prayers that have no wings.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Right. And so the building is filled with dead prayers. What an interesting thought, right? When do you pray that your prayers don't go to God? All right. That's an interesting question.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I think that was a warning back then to religions to not be dead, for lack of a better word, right? Not to have dead prayers, not to have that, not to lose that connection that provides the connectivity between and among people.
I was flipping through Fox the other day, and they have this priest and rabbi combination from New York City. I can't think of either one of their names, but they're always on together. And they were talking about this new Gallup survey that about mainstream religions, and we're talking like pretty large percentages of decrease in a lot of these religions, and those are scary numbers.
They are scary numbers. America actually had and still probably has higher religious participation than countries where there is a state religion. You might think that that's counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is counterintuitive.
Okay, that you would think that a state religion would force everybody to do it. What they get is names on the roll. What they don't get is participation. And there's an interesting side piece to that. I think it was actually one of the smartest decisions that our founding fathers in America were smart to not create a state religion, recognizing that the majority of Americans then, and still, and barely a majority anymore, were Christian, but to not connect it to the state. Why does religious participation decrease? Because if state and religion are unified, then all of the mistakes government makes get associated with the religion. If they're tied together and somebody doesn't like what's happening at the head office, they stop going to church or to synagogue or to mosque. And so you get a lot of people who, they don't have to go and participate because it's the state-mandated religion. So all of the state holidays are going to match that holiday, those holidays. All of the different stuff is going to be tied in. So there's less incentive to identify. It's a default identity.
We had a friend who was a Moscow correspondent briefly for NBC, and he was talking about how there were so few people going to Russian Orthodox churches that, in theory, that was the state religion of Russia. But the fact that the government really didn't want anybody to go to church.
Right, so they discouraged it
Yeah.
in many, many overt and covert ways.
Sure.
Societies often exert tremendous pressure. So that brings up, the other side to it, right? If you getting back to what I started with, if you think that you're superior just because you're Baptist or just because you're Jewish or Orthodox Jewish or, this kind of a Hindu or that kind of a Muslim, you need to do some inner searching and find out what your issues really are. And what's coming to my mind is a situation that happened to me when I was in 4th grade, which was that a bully wanted to beat me up to prove to me that Jesus loves me. And, we sit here now, and it's like, what part of that began to make sense? But, yeah.
Speaking of absurdities.
Right. Well, and that's the point where religions don't teach that. Even though there is misogyny and sexism and xenophobia and all of those other isms in sacred texts of all traditions and all philosophies, actually, Eastern and Western, there are traces of it because humans wrote those things. And yes, God may have dictated something, an angel may have dictated it, but a human eventually redacted it and committed it to paper. Okay, somewhere along the line. There have been scribal emendations, corrections, whatever you want to call them.
I haven't heard that word in a while. Emendations.
Yeah.
Woo.
Yeah, all those things, right? So, when you've got human beings, then you've got imperfections. And as I started earlier with, I've got stuff I still have to work on. I'm far from perfect. I have no illusions of being perfect. I just really think it's important to keep working. And, and so when you make an instant judgment, and when you walk into a room and you think, how come that person can do the same things I'm doing, like eating in a nice restaurant, being a doctor, the head of something, being a lawyer, then you've got some privilege going on inside you. If it surprises you, you've got privilege going on. And you need to check that. You need to really take a look and say, maybe I've got a few preconceived opinions that are shielding it. And, right, the justification is not that everybody else does it. That's a fallacy. Just because everybody does it doesn't make it right. Right? There's a lot of heinous things that the majority have supported for whatever reasons, because they're getting on the bandwagon, and they've been brought in by other fallacies, and so what's one more? And I saw I was like, the philosopher and the critical thinker in me just shakes my head so often at the garbage, and I don't have a better word for it, that goes on. There was somebody who was criticizing country A. Let's put it that way. Let's try to decongest this. Country A for some opinion, and then goes on to say, well, what about all these other countries? Well, it doesn't matter what all these other countries are. If the claim is that country A does X. And that's the argument on the table, and that argument needs to be refuted on the basis of whether or not it's true, not whether or not somebody else does it, not whether or not somebody did it historically. Those are all interesting, but they're not germane to the premise that country X is doing Y, or something like that, or person X is doing Y. And it doesn't matter if, except in a court of law where the testimony of the witness comes into question, it really doesn't matter what the person is who's saying it. And even if they commit a fallacy in their statement, it doesn't make it not true. That's another kind of fallacy. That just because you used a fallacy to put forth your argument doesn't mean the statement is not true. Right? So that's all part of critical thinking. It's where you take a look at the claim, at the premise, and you determine whether or not it's a true and or valid premise. Nothing else is appropriate. So calling somebody a bad name is an ad hominem fallacy. It has nothing to do with what's going on. And so we look at society, and society is sexist, misogynistic, discriminatory, racist, all of those things. We do that all the time. I was on a cruise in December, and there were a number of various. I was busy being the psychologist, person watcher kind of thing, right? And I was watching people walk in. There was a number, probably a greater number than I saw the previous year, of blacks that were participating in it. And I thought, wow, that's really great. It's not so homogenous, right? And there's not that many Orientals other than the servers, right? And it's okay to have somebody, And I was watching people look at that and have these facial reactions. And I'm like, oh, you folks really need to look at that and see why you think that's not okay. Of course it's okay. Anybody who pays the fare is entitled to have a great dinner.
Sure.
Period.
Obviously. Yeah.
And it, and somebody is not relegated to a service position. And yes, the folks that serve you on a cruise put you in a fantasy land of thinking that everybody's, treating everybody like you're a king. And maybe it's, I'm such a basic person that I notice that. And I don't think I'm entitled to it. I've not been wealthy that long. I'm, yes, I am richer than most of the world, and I get that just by being American. And we tend to not catch that. There's a website out there called Your Slavery Footprint. You can Google it and find it. But I take one of the classes through it. And, as a class, we come up with a homogenous, or not homogenous.
What was it again?
Your slavery footprint.
Your slavery footprint.
And you look at the things that you have in everyday life, like cell phones, iPads, Wiis, computers,
that you have in front of you right now.
Yeah, the things that I have in front of me right now.
Yeah.
And you come to realize that, there are slaves in these industries of many different types, depending on where, when, and how. And so it gives you an estimate based on how much clothes you have, what you eat, all different kinds of things. How many slaves work for you? And for our class this semester, the one class that's gone through the footprint, which is my ethics class, there were 51 slaves.
Wow.
And, so it comes up at the end and it says 51 slaves help you live your life. And, it was interesting to look out at my class, which is a very diverse class. And that's one of the things I love about IRSC, is that the student body is very, very, all kinds of people. And it makes the classes, I think, much more interesting to have that mix of cultures and viewpoints. And it's some awakening for everybody. Because here's the other really bad piece. Just because you've been discriminated against doesn't mean you aren't also a racist, bigot, sexist, etc. You have the isms too.
We were down in Hialeah last weekend with IRSC, and one of the players on the opposing team was Muslim, and she was covered. Mm-hmm. And she came over and looked at me, and she said, "You're not afraid of me, are you?" I said, "No, why would I be?" I just thought that was so weird.
Yeah.
But, and it brought to mind this news story I saw about the mosque that was blown up by Al-Qaeda. And, the newscaster said something bizarre about what's wrong with Islam. And I'm thinking, that had nothing to do with it. I mean,
it's not Islam.
It's not Islam.
It's not Islam. It's not Judaism. It's not Christianity.
Man.
It's not Sikhism. It's not any faith tradition. It's that Sikh people wrap themselves in religious robes.
Exactly.
Right. The sad part about it is like that little girl Mary that wanted to beat me up, is that to my fourth grade mind, she became the Christian.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so for many, many years, I was traumatized by the idea that Christians were going to beat me up. Right? She became the spokesperson in that moment, because I didn't have a good, strong Christian friend network. I was the only Jew in school, and I didn't have very many friends. We had just moved there. And, so this bully was going to, whatever. So yeah, it left me not trusting Christians for many, many years. And I had to work through that. I had to work through trusting people named Mary, especially little blondes. But as I like to, yeah.
Yeah, you don't think about that.
Don't think about those things, right? But when you're a kid, things impress you, and especially things that scare you, really leave an impression. And unfortunately, it's the child that analyzes the moment. And so you don't do a good job of it. And, one of the ways that I had to check that is, when and where did I come up with the idea that Christians weren't trustworthy? And, eventually I realized it was that incident. And, because the person that I thought was my best friend led me into the ambush. So there were several layers into this that added to my mistrust. And, yeah. And so how many times would something like that play out? On the other side of that, I have, we've talked about other times, if somebody starts out the conversation by telling me that they're a Christian or they're this or they're that, it's like, and I'm not going to be able to know that from your behavior, right? You've got to tell me it so that perhaps I can figure it out. And so here's one of my pet peeves, if you will. There's a song that sometimes I hear people sing, which is, if I have harmed somebody today, if I have walked in my own I don't remember the exact words, I've walked in my willful way, dear God, forgive. Now that sounds wonderful, but what about the person you hurt? How about making restitution and asking that person for forgiveness?
Ooh, yes.
Right? Don't leave it to God to do that. Own your stuff, face up to it, and apologize for what you have done and how that's played in. Because that's a big piece of it. Right? Christianity doesn't teach that it's okay to run around and lie, cheat, and steal, and it'll be okay in the end. You'll get out of jail free card because, anyway, yeah. That's not how any religion I know is really based. And yet there are people certainly who act as if that was the case. I would argue that those are people who didn't really get their Sunday school lessons and they didn't really read scriptures, but
no 5 Hail Marys and
yeah. Well, yeah, but right, but the piece before the Hail Mary is that you've got to own it, right? And do a confession. Now, do you do restitution? Maybe not. Judaism requires that you do restitution. So I confess
that makes sense.
That I'm coming from that bias, right? That if I hurt somebody, it's my responsibility to repair that damage. Now, conversely,
but again, isn't that common sense?
I would argue that it would be, but again, I think it is, and I think it's important, regardless of which faith tradition you're in, all of them teach that God creates all people, right? And even some religions that started out with some misogyny and some xenophobia and some ism have worked their way through, right? They continue to work and work on that. Muhammad said women are God's creation. And so what is he fighting? He's fighting the tribalistic stuff that was in the area that was not treating women with good equality. And Confucius, now there's somebody who said, the wife obeys the husband. But part of what he was really getting at was that the husband needs to behave in an honorable way to earn that position. Right? Everybody should be chunzi, which is... And so people often misrepresent some of that stuff, right? Confucius said that subjects should obey the leaders, but he wasn't telling the people to do that. He was telling the leader, you are the wind, you bend them by how you behave. If you aren't chunzi, if you aren't an honorable person, they're not going to be strong. They're not going to be able to do the things that people need to do within the government structure. He actually went very often to the leaders and argued, your taxes are too high for the people. They can't pay them. If you lower the taxes, they'll be more productive and you'll get more in the end. So he actually had a much better view than people today give him credit for. Yeah, because he was aiming his teachings by teaching the common folk to be good. He was really working on the leaders, and he continually advised the leaders to treat their people well so that they could be strong. So again, that often gets missed. And people who want power push down. It's why Sartre said, religion's not good. Marx said, right, it's the opiate of the people, because he saw it being used that way.
We ran into a player Wednesday night, as a matter of fact, from South Sudan. And you have no idea. If you think you have problems, this is a young man whose entire family was slaughtered.
Yeah.
And he made it out and somehow made it to the other school. And wow, you hear that and you think, wait a minute, this is an 18 or 19-year-old kid.
Yeah, and this is 2020. Hello. It's still going on.
Oh, yeah.
That's one of the... And I get in trouble for pointing this out to people. The Holocaust was absolutely horrible and should never have happened. And neither should any of the other genocides, purifications, whatever people want to call them. That's people abusing, being in a position of being able to bully. And it doesn't justify anything down the road, other than let's get rid of that whole human behavior. Let's have a sea change in human consciousness so that we don't think it's okay to automatically kill somebody's family. Right? A lot of that, unfortunately, is really being done to get their possessions. If you can isolate a minority, then you can liberate, quote unquote, their possessions. Because if there's no heirs, there's nobody to take their stuff. It's really stealing and wrapping somebody in some sense of holiness that's really not there. And that could be Al-Qaeda doing it. It could be Boko Haram doing it. Boko Haram's much worse than Al-Qaeda, as bad as Al-Qaeda is. And you've got this mix of tribalism, paternalism, white privilege, black privilege. And yes, there's some of both. There's a lot of discrimination within groups as to who's the inner in, right? Like colored blacks, dark colored blacks. There's discrimination between those two groups, because the finer we bring our little groups, the more we out people for being slightly different. Anything that you can use to minoritize, I don't know if that's a verb or not, but to minoritize a group and thereby isolate them from getting support. That's one of the points of ism, is to get people to not stand up and say, this is wrong. We are all human beings. We are all God's children. And whether you use God or life or however, we all have a right to breathe air. We all have a right to eat. We all have a right to work hard. We have a right to have education, all of those things. And the countries that get it have greater happiness. Now, there's a counter side to that, which is that if you're horribly, if you all look the same, then you're dealing with finer points of it, and those might be easier to work around. So those are, I think, important things that we need to do. It's not that religion encourages it; it's that people wrap themselves in religious robes, and they come to represent religions, even though they're not. And I think that's important, right? We want people to be spokesmen for this or for that. And hello, we're all human. And except for the king of Id, we all put our pants on one leg at a time. There's an old King of Id cartoon where he's
sure.
jumping off the bed saying, one leg at a time, my foot.
Wow, you're even bringing a newspaper reference
even
into this
bringing
thing.
in newspaper
Wow.
and comic strips.
Comic strips.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All those things. So this is as good a time as any to say, hey, folks, if you like what you're hearing, if you, first of all, if you want to ask a question of this rabbi, please give me a call at 772-340-1590. And also, if you'd like to hear more of me talk, if you like what you're listening to, and you've stuck with me for the 45 minutes that we're into this hour, then please consider sponsoring an episode or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of Ask a Rabbi. And really do appreciate that, appreciate being able to bring this to people. It makes a huge difference when we can get a little bit of sponsorship. You can get sponsorship by calling the temple. You can get sponsorship by calling the radio station. Give them a call at 772-340-1590 and tell them you'd like to sponsor Ask a Rabbi. And they'll work with you, or the temple will work with you. And we're a 501c3 organization, so you can get the donation that way if you care to. Many different ways, or you can give me a call. My number's actually on our website and on Facebook. And I hope that this has been good. If anybody does have a question, again, please give me a call, 772-340-1590. Please feel free to join me at the Martin Luther King Memorial Service, Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., at Morningside. And I know that there's a number of other events throughout the city.
So were all of your students aware of Dr. King and his accomplishments?
Most of them are not, I think.
Yeah.
It's a history book item, right?
I know.
It's history. Some of them are not even, here's a real sobering thing, some of them were not alive when 9/11 happened.
Oh, no, I'm well aware of that.
Right? And so for them, that's history books. For them, segregation is strange. And one of the things that I show in one of the movies is Best of Enemies, which is the story of, and I think it's Waterman and C.P. Ellis, who was the great whatever of the KKK in that town in North Carolina, I think Durham. And leading the charge for desegregation. North Carolina was one of the last states, even though it had been outlawed. You got to push it down, and somebody's got to do it. And the spark that happens is that the black school burns down, and the kids have to go to school somewhere. Where are they going to go to school? And people that were smarter got these two, this black woman and this KKK leader, white man, to work as chairmen together. And, they originally hated each other because of who and what they were and how their identities were formed. And, their kids actually came up to them and said, this is crazy. We're just kids. We want to go to school together.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they woke up, which is the really good news. They woke up and they started working together. And that's a true story. You can Google it, C.P. Ellis. And Best of Enemies is the movie that was made about it. And I show the trailer to that. And it was interesting to me. It was like, what? The kids were like, when's that movie coming out? It's like, it came out a while ago.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Long time ago. Go to. I'm assuming that Netflix has it. I'm assuming that Prime has it. Hulu, all of those where you can stream it. Go ahead and look at that movie. It's based on a true story, and both C.P. Ellis and Ann were consultants on the movie.
We on the bus coming back, we were watching a movie, the Don Haskins story at Texas El Paso, which was Texas Western back in the day, and he recruited 5 black players. And of course, there was an uproar in El Paso because they never, seen anything quite like that. And of course, they played the University of Kentucky, and that was an all-white team. And so it's amazing to see how all of that And one of the players asked me, he said, that didn't really happen. I said, you
Oh,
bet.
yeah.
You bet it did.
Yeah.
And I said, I know the big guy myself. And, they just can't comprehend that the whites and blacks aren't playing together.
Yeah. Yeah,
know?
Because today it's so common.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so bad with names, and you probably know the name, the black athlete who went to Germany for the Olympics when Hitler was in power.
Oh, Jesse Owens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I knew you'd know the name. Right.
You bet.
The story of Jesse Owens and America purposely, right, supported him to point out that it doesn't really matter what you look like. You can still be a great athlete. You can still be this. You can be that. I mean, it helps, obviously, if you're tall, if you're going to play basketball. Helps if you're big, if you're going to play football. But, those are not...
Germany did not appreciate that move, by the way.
Of course not. Of course not.
That threw all her teachings out the window.
Yeah. Well, anything that teaches that one group is inherently better than another is in trouble, and needs to be checked. And I'm sorry. We are all human. We all have different strengths. We all have gifts. We all have unique pieces to put into the mosaic of the human story. And it's a mosaic. It should not be a melted stew, and it really does need to be. The minority voice has to have a voice, and that voice has to be protected. There are some challenges with majority rule if it abuses the minority.
I get you.
Right.
Yeah.
Just because 51% of the people say A doesn't make it right. And so there are some challenges. Minority voices need to be there because they help.
Well, and with the growth of the Hispanic community in the United States, the Anglos are going to be a minority soon.
Well, I think that white is becoming the minority, and there'll be some rough times as that works through. South Africa has faced some of it, and they're still working on it. Lots of groups, everybody's still working on it. We've all got some of it. And it works slightly differently in different scenarios. And so we need to work on that idea that people are inherently worthwhile, even the people who do things you don't like. And God isn't going to make everything clean. Right? That's there's a line that is not usually translated quite that way. But one of the things that God says is, don't attach my name to things that have to do with vanity, for I will not clean up your mess. I will not clean it up. I will not make it okay. And if somebody wants to deal with me, I'll deal with the Hebrew with that. That's what it says tonight. I will not make it clean. So clean up your own mess. You mess up your room, you mess up your house, you mess up your country, you got to clean it up. And those are not easy things to do.
So it's the University of California is fighting a battle right now where they have a large group of Asian students, which they're now classifying as white. Which is
okay,
it's like, okay, this is interesting.
If you go down my Facebook wall a little bit, you'll find a section there that deals with the Jews of Calcutta, which is an interest in Indian nationals, Jewish by faith tradition, and they're lighter-skinned Indians, and because they're Jewish, the British Army was more than willing to recruit them because they considered them gray.
Oh God.
Yeah, right. So you want to deal with something that really has nothing to do with anything. It's those kind of crazy things. I'm sorry. Life is much more than than that. And you've got a very small life if you have to busy yourself with that stuff. Let's deal with things like curing pancreatic cancer. Let's deal with things like how can we find out about hurricanes and where they're going to hit so that we can tame nature, perhaps. And let's be aware of the dangers of doing that, right? We start messing with what's going on in the planet.
Yeah, I was going to say, now, wait a minute.
Yeah, because the planet's trying to heal itself right now.
Sure.
So let's learn and let's be a little more cautious before we bring in a problem like the Melaleuca trees in Florida that are a bigger problem than the problem they're trying to solve. And let's find a way to treat people for cancer that doesn't almost kill them. We're making a lot of, and medical advances just blow my mind. I remember what it was like as a kid going to the dentist and what it was like 2 weeks ago to go to the dentist. Totally different
I wish you
experience.
would mention dentist. I've got to go next week.
But it's so much better.
Yeah.
It is so much better, and they do a much better job. And some of that comes out of tragedy, unfortunately. Right? We learn from tragedy. We learn from what happens. And if we don't use it, if we don't use what we learn, then that becomes a waste. Right? And that's one of the other instructions of scriptures. Don't make a waste of people. It's what Abraham is told when he goes to sacrifice Isaac. Lo ta'aselo ma'ama. Don't make of him a waste. Don't waste your child, forcing him to be a mini-me. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. The psychologist can read through that story really quickly and see many things that are pretty deep, pretty powerful. And, we need to encourage each person to explore their strengths, their gifts, in ways that are constructive. And I think that's the bottom line, is what you're doing, learning from your mistakes and moving forward. There's no value in beating yourself for mistakes. You do need to make restitution. You need to learn from them, but then you need to move forward. That's what life's about. There are successes in life, and there are learning opportunities. And all people have something to contribute at the table. They have a seat at the table. They need to have a seat at the table. And if you're not allowing them that seat, then check your own ism, your own sense of privilege. Because people need to get to the table based on their merit and what they can contribute, not based on some superfluous outside thing of whether or not they've got curly hair or polka dots on their shirt. And, when we get there, then I think we'll see much more beauty in the world. And that's my hope, as we slowly working our way through winter, that not only does the planet start to thaw after we have the next couple storms, but, life continues to come back. Buds come, right? They just found baby turtles. And, we go from there. So, yeah, very, very valuable. Thank you. This has been Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim. Thank you for listening to Ask a Rabbi.
And how do folks find you?
People can find us on Friday nights at 540 Northwest University Boulevard, Suite 102. Friday night services at 7:30. Shabbat morning at 10:30. And join us this Monday at Morningside at 10 o'clock for a Martin Luther King special service.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie. Talk of the Treasure Coast and webcaster to the world on Alexa and Google Home.